Our background was from living in the UK. So that was Victorian terraced houses, tenement flats in Scotland. These are traditionally quite small dwellings with one bathroom, a couple of bedrooms and one living space and maybe a separate kitchen. So we were not used to large, sprawling houses. We were not used to or required ensuite bathrooms. Things like that we didn't need. So that, in a way, guided the design, or simplified it, really.
Neil and Annie, even though they've come from living in Scotland, they've actually really embraced the idea of living in the subtropics. And
maybe that's kind of a celebration of being in Australia, in the Sunshine Coast, and kind of going
liberated.
Yeah, kind of let's take advantage of this through design.
But because we had the neighbours on the east and the west, and it was really sandwiched between, it's still a decent sized site, we closed down the western aspect to protect from that western sun, and the eastern to a certain extent, but opened right up to the north where the views are, but also to the south to catch those cross ventilation breezes and to protect from privacy, but also protect from the sun.
The north-south axis of the breezeways are really set up as the lungs of the house. Whether it's a north breeze or a southeasterly, the breezeway funnels that breeze into the spaces.
If the kitchen's the heart of the house or the hearth of the house, then the breezeway is the lungs of the house. We really needed to provide spaces that connected the inside to the outside with decking. You get the breeze up underneath the decks and everything, but you also get the extension of space so that it feels bigger. And all of the spaces, the living spaces, the kitchen, the bedrooms, they all open out onto an external space of some sort. We designed all of the spaces so they could be naturally ventilated. There's no air conditioning in this house. And one of the principles we really followed was making sure that you get cross ventilation from one side of the room to the other. So you've got to have at least two openings and not just rely on an internal door. And so all of the spaces in this house have access to ventilation, natural ventilation, and most of them, 80 to 90% of them, actually have good cross ventilation. And that's the way that you can live without air conditioning. You just make sure you get great airflow.
And the idea of the two pavilions and the breezeway benefits that by allowing extra wall area for that natural light and ventilation into most of the spaces.
Mm. It's actually really nice to see how Neil and Annie almost rig the house. It's a bit like sailing, you know. You rig the spinnaker when there's a fabulous wind behind it to take advantage of it. So the fins on the side channel the breezes as you need them, and the sunlight as well. And you can see on the ones over facing east at the moment where the morning sun has been coming through to warm the space up, they're wide open. But the ones on the west at the moment are semi-closed, so ready for the afternoon sun. But you can still maintain the views through there. So the breeze and the sun, it all works together.
The battens in the breezeway provide a sort of filter to like a harsh sun condition. So we want as much natural light, but really reducing the heat. But that's a practical thing. But from a kind of more poetic standpoint, they provide this lovely marker of time. And they they dapple the light, which is, for us, it's so Sunshine Coast, is that quality of dappled light, light and shade, and the patterns, beautiful changing patterns that you can get, and really kind of it registers the time of day for Neil and Annie in terms of the way the light's dropping and casting shadows on the wall, the floor, back up the other wall, even in the moonlight. We knew that this site was challenging topography-wise because it was really steep and it had a pre-existing cut and fill before Neil and Annie bought the property. But we were looking at ways to actually make it a positive thing, that the site had been cut fairly brutally, I suppose.
Pretty radically.
And
actually.
kind of how can this project actually repair that topography and make the most of living up in the trees? So it was about, the height limits, the current drainage patterns, maintaining. The key environmental concerns for us were the roots of the trees. There's so many aspects of citing an environmental consideration when starting a project. the client and the architect recognised that the trees and the topography and rocks were a significant character of the site. They wanted to keep it intact and actually enhance it. So the strategy of the house was all about doing that in terms of the foundation design, the way it's perched up high in the trees. And, it was kind of like saying, what's the magic part of the site? Okay, let's not lose it. Let's work with that to make it even better. So on a practical level, to keep the trees safe, the foundations couldn't go into the root zone. But to make the most of the site and the height limit and the views, the house needed to perch off the side of the hill in a way.
Hover above.
And so there's this kind of thing about the footings had to be back, the house had to be forward. And so that, I guess that's, from a practical point, that gave the house its form in terms of the columns and foundations underneath.
The trees really give the place scale.
Yeah.
And if you took the trees away, the house would be different. The verticalities of the trees gives a beautiful framing to those long distance views, and the views are very horizontal, sort of punctuated by Mount Ninderry and Mount Coolum. So you've got this lovely horizontality and this beautiful verticality, and to capture those, sort of to frame those views, is really important. And
I guess there's two key views. There's on arrival at the entry at the end of the breezeway, you've got this really long distance framing of the gum tree at the end, and it's kind of a very vertical kind of framing of landscape. And then when you come into the main living space, and the deck is all about that horizontal crop of the long distance view of the range across. Yeah, I guess as a tree house, and it's from the view from the street, you're looking up, and it could tend to be imposing, but it's really the trees help give the house scale and make the house seem smaller in relation to the whole hillside.
There's just a classic character of the Sunshine Coast, which, quite often embraces the old fibro beach shack, the fishing shacks and things.
And there's kind of no fuss sort of authenticity and based on function, based on economy sort of response. And that idea of making a house that feels like you're on holiday.
The material palette that we worked with here is a lot of timbers, natural timbers, spotted gum, for example. The colours were drawing from the environment, so the trunks of the trees, which are that silvery gum grey ash sort of colour, plus the black. Some of the darker trunks of the trees have the black, and the neutral natural tones. It's almost like a blank canvas ready for life to take place on. So the colourful things come from the family's things.
It's really open to the street. Neil and Annie aren't really fence people, but I think it contributes to a friendly connection between the street and the house. And the security in this house is at the front gate, which is at the end of the breezeway.
I actually think this house would work equally as well for an older couple or an older family, because some of the things that we consider on all projects is trying to get the flush thresholds, have wide enough hallways or openings so that it suits everybody.
But just having an easy living environment, so spaces flow into each other quite seamlessly from indoors to outdoors and vice versa. But there's a kind of easiness to living in this house. There's two aspects to modular design that we enjoy, and one is the economical aspect of reusing standard building components, therefore reducing waste, reducing materials that you use. But the other side is expressing that in the aesthetic of the construction, so that you kind of express that the sheet cladding is sheets that are kind of 12 by 2400, and I guess the aesthetic comes from the act of building.
And if you do want to modify any of the spaces or the architecture in the future, those standard size components are really easy to replace and easy to work in with a regular grid on future modifications.
Sustainability was a consideration in the selection of the material palette. We've got Queensland hardwoods, plantation grown pine framing, readily accessible, recyclable steel, hardwood plywood. These are all materials that are kind of very easily renewable, and add to the ongoing resilience and kind of sustainability of the house.
We designed this house with plenty of light and plenty of natural ventilation because it reduces energy costs significantly without the need for air conditioning.
The economics of the project meant that solar would be a future addition, but putting the infrastructure in the first part of the build was, fairly critical.
When we designed the house, we thought about the way it should be lit and the way that it should be powered, and really wanted to keep the power system simple rather than going with a C-bus or something that's a bit more complex, because on, off and dim is just a lot more future-proofing of the technology.
It's also part of that easy living sort of house.
One of the most valuable things about the house is the fact that it's actually done fairly economically.
Not only in its initial construction, but also in its ongoing costs. In terms of adding value to livability, the key one there is really about how the house feels, how the spaces feel, and how they make you feel. Like the experience of the house is probably paramount in terms of how comfortable you are as an occupant or human in the space.
One of the biggest compliments we get, and particularly with this house, is that it just makes you feel good. The spaces feel great.
So it's less about aesthetics and more about kind of, comfort.
One of the things that we really strived for was to design a house that was going to be really timeless as well, so that it doesn't date. And that really adds value in terms of holding its value over the decades.
Engaging architects, I guess a lot of people get frightened that it's going to be a really costly affair, but for us it was, it helped us save on areas that we probably would have spent more money but we didn't need to, in terms of like having higher ceilings, making the space feel bigger, and using materials that were sustainable, and hard wearing as well. Things that we splashed out on a little bit were more decorative things like lighting, but otherwise Steve and Lindy were brilliant in cost saving exercises, like having everything was a standard size so we didn't have to have things custom made, changing a cement floor to the plywood, which we're so glad we did because that was a huge cost saving thing for us, and we just love the warmth that it brings to the house as well, because we don't have air conditioning or anything like that. We have like ceiling fans, and then we do have the louvers, and especially having the ones up high, you just get that flow through of air all the time.
My friends like coming over to my house because of all of the light and how spacious and breezy it is in the hallway.
Yeah.
And when we run, we don't get that hot because of a nice breeze coming from the sea, then we just get pretty much all of it.
Yeah, awesome.